Good afternoon, everyone. Last week on Friday, we started talking about the Cold War and how I talked about some of the events during the early Cold War. This week's video lecture, I'm going to concentrate in on the impact that the Cold War had upon American society, particularly upon politics in the United States, and how we start to see this sort of virulent anti-communism developing on the American home front, as it were, and the kind of anxiety that both the fear of communism and the fear of nuclear war created in American society, and how we see that manifested in American culture. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So, anti communism in the United States is very often associated with the Cold War era, but it actually starts much, much earlier. It really goes all the way back to 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution when it happens in Russia. But you can also see roots of it even in the late 19th century, with all the fears of radical European immigrants bringing socialist and anarchist ideas into the United States. But in the wake of the First World War, now that communism was a concrete reality and the basis for a government in the world, we see the first real manifestation with the Red Scare, sometimes called the First Red Scare, of 1919 to 1920. This was a short but very intense period of political intolerance that was inspired by the wave of labor strikes after the war and the social tensions and fears generated by the Russian Revolution. So, the Attorney General at the time, a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, he became convinced that the widespread labor strikes that immediately followed the end of the First World War were part of a worldwide communist conspiracy to spread revolution around the globe, and particularly to the United States. So he sends federal agents to raid the offices of labor organizations and radical groups throughout the country. These raids were presided over by a young man named J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover, of course, is going to continue to pursue communists when he later becomes the head of the FBI. More than 5,000 people were arrested in the Palmer raids. Most of them were held for months without being charged of any crime. Hundreds of immigrants were deported in the wake of the war. Palmer was very heavily criticized at the time by politicians and by the media for his severe abuse of civil liberties, but the damage was done. The raids were a major setback to radical and labor organizations like the International Workers of the World, and they fostered the idea that being a patriotic American meant supporting the political and economic status quo and conformity. And of course, we're going to see these ideas resurface again in the 1940s and 1950s. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was a very small but very active Communist Party in the United States. And especially in the 1930s, there were many Americans on the left side of the political spectrum who were not communists themselves, but who may have worked with or socialized with communists because they had shared goals. In the 1930s, communists in the United States were involved in many different activities, including demonstrations of the unemployed, struggles for labor unions, and many were very committed to the fight for Black civil rights in the 1930s. The Communist Party was really one of the only organizations in the United States that was very much committed to advancing the cause of civil rights. Communists generally tended to be supportive of FDR's New Deal, and they worked to promote social change and a vision of a pluralistic, diverse America. They were also strongly anti-fascist, and so we see the rise of fascism in the 1930s. Communists and the Communist Party in the United States really pushes back against the rise of fascism. But there was a strong pushback against communism and radicals that also begins in the 1930s. In 1938, the House of Representatives establishes an Un-American Activities Committee to investigate potential disloyalty. Now, of course, this committee is going to play a major role in the anti-communism of the late 1940s and 1950s. And just think about that name for a second. Un-American activities. How are they defining what it means to be un-American here? Basically, it included communists, labor radicals, anyone who was on the left side of the political spectrum. Uh, and Congress also got involved in a sort of larger way by passing legislation. In 1940, Congress passed the Smith Act, which made it a crime to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of the government. States also began to investigate possible subversives on the state level as well. So we can see that the roots of anti-communism go back to much before the Cold War begins. The Cold War greatly heightens the anti-communism that had already existed in America, and ultimately it takes it far beyond anything that had been seen before. Because the Cold War was, at least in part, an ideological struggle, it seemed to matter very greatly what your political views were and whether you were on the side of the United States or on the side of the Soviet Union. There were really only two alternatives. As you know, one historian has suggested dividing the world up between the free world and the, sort of world that's under tyranny, between liberty and slavery. It automatically makes those who could be linked to communism the enemies of freedom. The anti-communism began almost simultaneously with the advent of the Cold War itself. So in 1947, just after he announces the Truman Doctrine and pledges America to fight against communism anywhere in the world, Truman also establishes a loyalty review system for government employees. Anyone who was accused had to somehow demonstrate that you were a patriotic American. Sometimes you weren't allowed to know who had accused you or why you might have been accused. Several hundred people get fired under this investigations, and many more resigned in protest rather than submit to being investigated. Then, of course, we have the famous House Un-American Activities Committee Hollywood hearings. Now, if you look at this from a kind of a cynical perspective, it seems pretty obvious that one of the reasons why the House Un-American Activities Committee decided they were going to call up and investigate potential communist leanings in Hollywood was they wanted to get national publicity for themselves, and so they decided to call a bunch of famous celebrities to Washington to testify about potential communist influence in the motion picture industry. A lot of famous actors and directors testified that the movie industry harbored communists. 10 men, mostly producers and screenwriters, famously refused to answer the committee's questions. They were asked things like, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" That was sort of the sort of famous phrasing of that question. And because they refused to answer, they were held in contempt of Congress. These men ended up serving time in prison, and they, along with many others who, sort of were less well known, got blacklisted in Hollywood, which meant that they were no longer able to work under their own names. Sometimes they had to assume pseudonyms. They had to, take pay cuts, produce scripts, and produce, sort of material for much less money than they had before. So it was a very difficult time for a lot of people in Hollywood. Now, of course, the name that most often gets associated with anti-communism during the Cold War is Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was elected as a senator from Wisconsin in 1946, but his first few years in the Senate were pretty unremarkable. He was a popular speaker and he was a guest at a lot of Washington cocktail parties, but his fellow senators found him a little bit difficult to work with, and he had a bit of a quick temper, so he wasn't all that well liked. He was active initially in kind of labor issues. He had a reputation as being kind of a moderate Republican. He catapults himself into the national spotlight in February of 1950 when he gives a speech before a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia. And if we think a little bit about the kind of larger context for this speech, what is going on when he gives this speech in the sort of early spring, February, late winter, early spring of 1950? Well, just a few months earlier, back in the fall of 1949, two major events, right? You have the Soviet Union explodes their own atomic weapon for the very first time. So now America has lost its monopoly on nuclear weapons. And it appears that there has been some, sort of espionage going on and some nuclear espionage. And the other sort of big event, of course, is the fact that China has now become a communist country. Just a few weeks after the Soviets explode their bomb, China sort of officially is falling to communism. And the United States and the Truman administration especially, gets a lot of criticism for having let China go, for not having prevented the communists from coming into power in China. And the other sort of, big thing that's going to happen in 1950 is, of course, the breakout of the Korean War. So McCarthy comes on the scene right at this time when there's all these heightened tensions. The Cold War is escalating again, and he's able to sort of capitalize on that. So in this famous speech that he gives, he claims that the State Department is, quote unquote, infested with communists and that he has a list of their names. And he basically just runs with it. And this is an excerpt from McCarthy's address that he gives here. And I want to look at the text of it a little bit because he's making some really interesting arguments here. And if we kind of tease out the language he's using, we can see the rhetorical flourishes and strategies that he's using to kind of, convince people that there is a problem and that, there is this sort of enemy within, as he, sort of might have put it. So he says, today we are engaged in a final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. Remember, he's giving this speech before a Republican women's club in West Virginia, so he's probably trying to appeal to their religious beliefs here. He says, as one of our outstanding historical figures once said, when a great democracy is destroyed, it will not be because of enemies from without, but rather because of enemies from within. And he says, the truth of this statement is becoming terrifyingly clear as we see this country each day losing on every front. It has not been the less fortunate or the members of minority groups who have been selling this nation out, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer, the finest homes, the finest college education, the finest jobs in government that we can give. This is glaringly true in the State Department. There are the bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouths are the ones who have been the worst. In my opinion, the State Department, which is one of the most important government departments, is thoroughly infested with communists. I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy. So I think the language he uses, the words he uses here are really interesting. Think about what are some of the words that stick out to you here? Definitely enemies from within, and he's talking about the country losing on every front. So he's arguing that the U.S. is losing the Cold War here. And then he makes a very interesting sort of claim. He says, it's not the less fortunate who have been selling this nation out, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer. These are the young men who have been born with silver spoons in their mouth. So he's making a populist argument here. He's making an argument that, and a classist argument. He's making an argument that it's the wealthy elite that we can't trust. It's, sort of these privileged individuals, not ordinary, hardworking Americans. No, it's, sort of these wealthy, elite young men who have gone to, sort of elite colleges. Also, another, kind of anti-intellectual argument here. Uh, so he's really sort of, using these rhetorical tools to demonize and attack. He says the State Department is infested with communists. So it's, sort of very much this idea of, kind of demonizing the enemy, dehumanizing the enemy, implying that they are somehow less than, even less than human in the language that they're using. So the language he's using is really interesting here. McCarthy continued to use anti-communism to attack with gusto many different areas of the federal government. He continues on this sort of for a number of years, including many elements within the Truman administration. Sympathetic newspapers followed what McCarthy was doing. And he was definitely sort of very adept at using this new medium of television to reach his audience. You got to figure, sort of television is a kind of a new thing on the scene at this point. And here is this sort of, interesting individual saying all of these sort of crazy, outlandish things. It's somebody that you kind of can't help but watch. So a lot of people are hearing this message, and he was very good at using the media. And his charges kept changing. That number, he first claims there's 57 people on the list, then there's 250, then there's 178. It all keeps changing, and he never actually offers any proof. And his colleagues cheered him on while Congress members from the sort of more moderate Republican Party wing of the party, they kind of keep their heads down to avoid becoming the target of his attacks. And his sort of arguments so captivated American attention that McCarthyism really comes to stand in for this whole sort of category of anti-communism that we see during the Cold War in America. And so he becomes kind of the sort of face and the voice for anti-communism and the anti-communist movement in the United States. There is some pushback against McCarthy. Famously, on June 1st, 1950, Senator Margaret Chase Smith, she was a Republican senator from Maine, she stood up against the Republican Senator Joe McCarthy and his supporters, who were just, essentially running roughshod over American democracy. Smith had an interesting career. She had been a teacher and a reporter, and she'd gotten into politics through her husband, who was a state legislator and a newspaperman. Pretty soon after they married, she got elected to the Maine Republican State Committee, so she was kind of, active in the Republican Party in Maine. And eventually, voters in Maine elected her husband to Congress. When they went to Washington, she worked for her husband as a researcher, a speechwriter, a press secretary. And then when her husband dies of a heart attack in 1940, voters elected Margaret to serve out his term. And then she gets reelected to Congress in her own right, 3 more times. And in 1948, she gets elected to the Senate. She wins like an overwhelming majority, 71% or something like that of the vote. When she was elected to Congress, the United States is still kind of getting used to the New Deal government that the Democratic president, FDR, had brought in to, kind of first combat the Great Depression and then to go on and fight for victory in the Second World War. And the Republican Party at this time was kind of divided between those who thought that this new system was okay and that it was, sort of something that was needed to, adjust the role of the government to fit the sort of modern world. But there was also a wing in the Republican Party who were really determined to roll all of those changes back and to kind of destroy that new form of government. Those who wanted to go move the government back to the form that it had been in the 1920s, when it has essentially been run by corporations and big businessmen, they had a problem because American voters liked the business regulation, the basic social safety net that the New Deal set up, and the infrastructure construction in this new system. So, because the New Deal was so popular, anti-New Deal Republicans said that, well, what's happening here, what's really happening is that the US government is sort of gradually sliding toward communism. And they start to sort of use that term, communism, to stand in for all of the changes and the reforms of the New Deal. And then, as I mentioned, in October of 1949, China wins power, the Communist Party wins power in China. And this makes it sort of seem like communism is now spreading across the globe, and it's pretty soon going to take over the United States. So Republican politicians are very eager to reclaim control of the government for the first time since 1933. They are sort of very interested to fan the flames of that fear. So that, of course, sort of leads to McCarthy, this undistinguished senator from Wisconsin, getting up and sort of claiming that he has this list of communists who are working in the State Department. So the anti-New Deal faction of the party really jumps on board with this. And pretty much the entire Republican Party, almost the entire Republican Party in Congress, essentially just either kind of, cheer him on or try to keep their heads down and ignore what he's doing. But Senator Smith recognized the damage that McCarthy and his sort of faction in the party were doing to the country. So on June 1st, 1950, 4 months after McCarthy makes his first infamous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, Smith gets up in the Senate and she makes a short speech. And she begins by saying, "I would like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition. It is a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that we Americans hold dear. I speak as a Republican, I speak as a woman, I speak as a United States Senator, I speak as an American." Senator McCarthy's sitting 2 rows behind her, and she gets up and starts condemning the leaders in her party who are, sort of making all these wild accusations. She says, "Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism." She argues that Americans have the right to criticize, to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, to think for themselves. But she says, freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it's not being exercised by others. And she goes on to explain that she wants a Republican victory in the upcoming elections. But she says, she doesn't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the 4 horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. She says, "I doubt if the Republican Party could do so, simply because I do not believe the American people will uphold any political party that puts political exploitation above national interest. Surely, we Republicans are not that desperate for victory." She says, "I don't want to see the Republican Party win that way." She says, "While this might be a fleeting victory for the Republican Party, it would be a lasting defeat for the American people." And so she says, "As an American, I condemn a Republican fascist just as much as I condemn a Democratic communist." She says, "They are equally dangerous to you and me and to our country." So she presents this what she calls a declaration of conscience. She lists 5 principles for which she hopes her party will adopt. And she says, she ends all this with this warning. She says, "It is high time that we all stopped being tools and victims of totalitarian techniques that, if continued here unchecked, will surely end what we have come to cherish as the American way of life." So only 6 other Republican senators signed on to Senator Smith's declaration. McCarthy calls her and her supporters Snow White and the six dwarves. Uh, Other Republicans kind of quietly applaud her for getting up and saying this, but they don't sort of refuse to kind of, give her public support. In the short term, her, speech gets pretty much forgotten. But she was, of course, right. 4 years later, after McCarthy has thoroughly disgraced himself by going after the army and has been taken down by the most trusted sort of journalist in America at the time, Edward R. Murrow, the Senate votes to condemn McCarthy. Senator Smith actually goes on later to run for president. She becomes one of the first women to run for president from a major political party. Eventually, she gets awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Of course, McCarthy has gone down in history as a disgrace to the Senate and to the United States of America. But the sort of damage that McCarthy did was pretty drastic and pretty, kind of difficult for a lot of people to deal with. And it became very difficult for many Americans in the 1950s to voice any opinion that was in any way critical of the United States. And so a lot of Americans, rather than face the consequences that might result from being labeled as disloyal, many people chose to keep silent and conform and not and gonna get along and not rock the boat or make waves. So I want you to kind of consider, was the anti-communism of the 1940s and 1950s justified in any way? Undoubtedly. And it's been totally proven that there were Soviet spies in the United States. But was the threat to American security and the American way of life real, or was it mostly imagined? And then think about what the consequences of anti communism were. Thousands of people across the country lose their jobs. Some even went to prison or get expelled from organizations who want to, quote, purge their members of suspected communists. We see government agencies like the FBI greatly expanding their power and sometimes pushing or even overstepping the bounds of what is actually legal. McCarthy and other Republicans used anti-communism to attack their political opponents and to discredit the ideas of the New Deal. They're able to block a lot of the domestic reforms that Truman wanted to put forward. And so the idea of expanding the New Deal welfare state ends up sort of fading away. And the uses to which anti-communism could be put were varied. White supremacists used anti-communism to discredit the civil rights movement. Businesses used it against unions and labor reformers. Defenders of morality and traditional gender roles called feminists or LGBTQ people communists and subversives. It was this incredibly versatile tool. One of the sort of big tools that gets used is that it is a very convenient way. The fight against communism and this sort of anti-communist movement is a way to link any behavior that is considered to be quote unquote deviant with communism and treason. And this leads to the so-called Lavender Scare, which is a widespread persecution of LGBTQ people in the 1950s. In the name of patriotism and anti-communism, thousands of people are fired from government positions for being quote unquote security risks. It was argued that being gay would leave a person being vulnerable to being blackmailed by communists and forced to divulge government secrets. Now, ironically, when people who were gay who were accused of this, they were being blackmailed by their own government. Their own government was saying, unless you admit to being gay and resign from your position or accept your termination of your position, we're going to tell your family. We're going to tell all your friends. We're going to publicly out you. And this was something that was very common at the time. There were, sort of they became target of investigators who were searching for subversives in government. And it was the systematic discrimination against and purging of gay and lesbian men and women from government positions in the 1950s. And it led to a number of people either having to resign, having to, sort of be fired. Some people even committed suicide when they were exposed. So it became a very, very difficult thing for a lot of people. And just this sort of atmosphere of loyalty and conformity that was created during the 50s really put a huge damper upon American society. Politically, the 1950s was a time in which consensus was really celebrated, and the boundaries of political debate were pretty narrow, and a lot of that had to do with anti-communism, which ends up silencing people on the left side of the political spectrum, and it makes any kind of radical political ideas very suspicious. But some of it also had to do with the political personalities of the time, particularly the man who was president for most of the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a very stark contrast with Truman, his predecessor. Eisenhower was wildly popular, and he seemed to kind of approach the presidency with a pretty casual manner. But beneath his very easygoing exterior, he was a very shrewd administrator behind the scenes. Of course, he had been a decorated general, so he knew how to, get people to do what he wanted and to compromise and to work together. He was very good at delegating authority, but he kind of projects this grandfatherly air, and he likes to go golfing, and so he's really seen as being kind of this very sort of easygoing guy. But he was actually very shrewd politically. Eisenhower definitely subscribed to traditional American attitudes about self-determination, about the superiority of American political institutions and values. He actively fought the Cold War. He very much distrusted the Soviets. He believed communism was this monolithic force that was striving for world domination, and that Soviets were orchestrating subversive activity around the world. He called the Soviet system a tyranny that has brought thousands, millions of people into slave camps and is attempting to make all mankind its chattel. So he definitely sees things in very black and white terms. He said in his inaugural address in 1953, "The forces of good and evil are massed and armed and opposed as rarely before in history. Freedom is pitted against slavery, lightness against dark." He was also, of course, a military man, and he, tended to be pretty cautious. He could, sort of be accommodative when it served his ends, and so he was, sort of actually fairly shrewd, even though he liked to use this sort of very apocalyptic language. He actually runs for president, partly because he doesn't want the Republican Party to be captured by an isolationist faction. He thought that America had global responsibilities, and he created a very strong presidency that was especially active in foreign policy. He was able to create kind of a domestic consensus for his policies that probably no other president since then has kind of been able to match. He was wildly popular, both on the, by Republicans, but also by Democrats. His cabinet was dominated by wealthy businessmen, and his administration was particularly favorable toward the business community. But although some in his party were calling for him to roll back the reforms of the New Deal, Eisenhower refused to do that. And he actually even expanded some of the core programs of the New Deal, like Social Security, during the 1950s. And he presided over the largest public works program in American history, the building of the federal highway system. So by today's standards, Eisenhower would not be considered all that conservative. Just FYI, you can see the posters or the signs in this photo say "We like Ike," "I like Ike." Ike was his nickname, and so that's sort of how a lot of people referred to him. President Eisenhower was a traditional Republican. He believed in low government spending. He doesn't want to run up the deficit. He doesn't want to make the economy dependent upon military spending. But he also believes the United States needs to maintain this active role in the world combating communism. And so, because of this, he develops a policy that becomes known as massive retaliation. Essentially, building up America's nuclear arsenal, start making a bunch of nuclear weapons because, making nuclear weapons is comparatively cheaper than maintaining a large army. So the size of America's nuclear stockpile doubles between 1953 and 1955. And the Army starts to consider nuclear weapons to be just like any other weapon, that they were really kind of just conventional. And so this is kind of part of this strategy of massive retaliation. Essentially means that the United States is going to threaten to use these weapons on this massive scale, and that in turn means that the US has to develop a large nuclear arsenal. Of course, it also means that war has to be avoided if at all possible. So the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as it was known, really comes to dominate thinking about the Cold War, at least in kind of government circles during the 1950s. Now, when it becomes clear that actually carrying out this threat of massive retaliation would basically be futile, because it would pretty much completely destroy the entire world, the only alternatives seem to be kind of developing a much more flexible policy and building up forces to fight non-nuclear conflicts. But by then, the arms race had already gotten almost completely out of control. And we also start to see in the 1950s civil defense programs being, kind of put into play, encouraging Americans to believe that it was possible to survive a nuclear war. And so encouraging people to build bomb shelters in their backyard, children diving under their desks in nuclear drills at school, and, sort of the government producing, cartoons like this one here, Bert the Turtle, telling people to duck and cover in the event of a nuclear attack. So there are a lot of, I think this really produces a certain amount of anxiety on the part of the American public. That's kind of an underlying anxiety, sort of people were not overtly necessarily afraid, but there's always this tension, there's always this fear, and the government is telling you, at any time, your city, your home could be destroyed by a nuclear weapon that's launched by our enemies, and so, we have to be prepared, we have to be vigilant. So the Federal Civil Defense Agency had, kind of produced a lot of kind of propaganda and sort of things that they were telling the American public about how to survive a nuclear war. These are just some examples. And sort of if you look at some of these visual images, these are some artifacts from 1950s efforts at civil defense. I think they tell us some interesting things about American society and culture during this era. Obviously, you can see, sort of the survival secrets for atomic attacks. Always put first things first. Try to get shielded. Drop first to the ground. Drop flat on the ground or the floor. Bury your face in your arms, but never lose your head. And sort of, kind of don't panic, basically. There are, sort of examples of fashion tips for the apocalypse here. Men should wear these wide-brimmed hats that could protect you from a heat flash. And sort of even after the bomb if the bomb were to fall, there were, civil defense planners were sort of delineating how men and women would do different jobs in the event of a nuclear attack. So you can see the men are doing, sort of things like firefighting and rescue work and police work and rebuilding, buildings. Women are sort of, caring for children and being hospital workers and social workers and doing emergency feeding. So we're definitely preserving gender role distinctions here. Very important to preserve the gender role distinctions. And then this is an advertisement that was put in the Wall Street Journal advertising a house. It says secluded 15-acre estate on Fairsize Lake beyond Luzerne, 25 minutes from Saratoga. So this is in upstate New York. A large, well furnished and equipped main house, 4-room guest house, large garage, accessory buildings, woods, gardens, boats, fishing, swimming. Good bomb immunity. Attractive summer home could be converted for resort or institutional purposes. So good bomb immunity. That's kind of an interesting thing to put into your real estate ad. So I think you can look at these and kind of really see how the Cold War and living in a now sort of, world with nuclear weapons, how this is affecting American society and culture during the 1950s. I'm going to put up on our course website a link to a really great documentary if you have time to watch it. It's called Atomic Cafe. And essentially, this is it's a historical documentary, but it's a little different from one that you may have seen, any that you may have seen before, in that it entirely consists of footage from government films, TV programs, all kinds of primary sources essentially that have just been cleverly edited together by the filmmakers to show how the atomic bomb changed American culture and society. And I'm going to put a link up to this video on our website. And if you have time, I would really highly recommend watching it. It's really an interesting film. It tells us a lot about what it was like to live in the 1950s and how there is this sort of underlying anxiety that's really fueling American culture during this era. All right, so that is it for my video lecture this week on, oh, this is not a right, kind of all right, sorry about that. Now we have the correct slide up here. So what to do before coming to class on November 6th? There's a set of primary sources on our Blackboard site that have to do with suburban America in the 1950s. And we may also end up talking a bit about Tuesday's election, depending upon what we know, what we don't know yet. We'll see kind of how things shake out. So we'll just have to kind of see about that. But before coming to class on Wednesday, please do sort of make sure to look at those primary sources. And I will see everybody on Wednesday. Have a great weekend, everyone.